from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today's subject is the historical review of the Warren Commission report concerning the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. For 31 years, speculation has continued about this subject and what all the facts might have been, and there are people who support that commission report and those who do not. We're very fortunate to have as our guest today a man who has historically studied this issue, and certainly, as all of you viewers know, with the enactment of Congress of legislation in the not near past, releasing more information. We're very pleased to welcome to the program from Lewis Clark State College in Lewiston, Idaho, Dr. Larry Happen, who holds a BA degree from the University of Washington in the field of history, and he holds a doctorate degree in speech from Washington State University. Our guest has studied this issue for many years, and he also did some very important research and consulting with the television program Frontline, which did a very, very in-depth story just a year ago. Dr. Happen, it's a great pleasure to have you on our program. We welcome you from Lewiston as we are here in Coeur d'Alene and via hookup in order to discuss this important subject. Welcome to our program.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
And I'm very pleased to have Steve Shink, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, to join me in questioning our guests on this most interesting and very important subject. And I shall ask Steve Shink to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Dr. Happen, I wonder if you could take just a moment or two to briefly give us a little bit more information about your background and specifically about your interest in the Warren Commission report.
Well, when President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, I was a freshman history major at the University of Washington. And I was also, I guess, at the age of 18 where an event like that just naturally has a tremendous effect on you. And so putting the two things together, this interest in history and this very dramatic, even traumatic kind of national event, then I simply developed an interest in the subject that's never really gone away.
I'm going to ask you one other background question before we get into the real meat of our show today. Could you tell our audience a little bit about the Warren Commission itself, how it was impaneled, what its mission was, and about the duration of its work?
Yes, a few days after the assassination of President Kennedy, President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, his successor, appointed a 7-man commission headed by the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, to do an independent and thorough investigation of all the circumstances surrounding the assassination, both the killing of the president and, of course, the subsequent murder of Lee Harvey Oswald by Jack Ruby. So this investigation then proceeded over the next roughly 10 months and eventually came out with a report in September of 1964. That report concluded that the assassination was the act of one individual acting alone, Lee Harvey Oswald, and that in turn Jack Ruby, who was a Dallas nightclub owner, had, again acting alone, killed Lee Harvey Oswald 2 days after the presidential assassination.
It would seem that everything is tied up in that tragic event pretty neatly. We have an authoritative commission who has determined, or which has determined, who the killer was. The killer didn't go to justice or to trial, but was killed. But normally you would expect that would close the chapter on that piece of our history. And yet 31 years later, there's been a recent feature film, and there remains tremendous interest in the assassination and tremendous controversy over the conclusions of the commission report. Why do you think that is?
Well, the murder of Oswald by Jack Ruby, rather than closing the door and stopping or putting a halt to interest in the subject, really simply generated a tremendous amount of further intrigue and suspicion about what might have been behind the assassination. On the other hand, if Oswald had not been murdered and had lived to stand trial, that might have put some closure on the event and might have dissipated much of the suspicion and controversy about the whole subject. But of course, the entire nation was deeply affected by what happened. And it is, of course, one of the greatest mysteries, I suppose, of the 20th century, along with the disappearance of Amelia Earhart or other possible examples of a historical event that leaves the public wondering and the public in doubt and the public with suspicions, perhaps, of a conspiracy or a cover-up or some grave explanation that they would like to better understand.
Larry, my question is a follow-up of what Steve just asked. Is it also complicated with the fact not only that Harvey Oswald was killed and did not go through trial and people did not see the evidence, but in a few years after that there were other tragedies, one of them being the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And again, the accused and convicted assassin was a man who was without money and had been in and out of prison, and yet he was found getting a passport going through Canada to London, and money found in his pocket. So there were a lot of mysteries behind that. Do these overlap to create even more suspicion on the part of the American people?
Well, yes. There was really a decade from the early 60s to the early 70s where we had a series of political assassinations or attempts, those including President Kennedy's, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, Malcolm X, George Wallace. And in some ways, they all had perhaps less than satisfactory explanations. And there was somewhat of a cumulative effect as far as the public having doubts that were simply reinforced by subsequent assassinations.
Would you also take a minute, we've mentioned the Warren Commission report and what its findings were. There have been a couple of other studies too. How do they, or do they differ in any way from the Warren Commission report and their conclusions?
Yes, they differ very much. There were really three major official investigations of the assassination of President Kennedy. The Warren Commissions in 1963 and 64, Jim Garrison's, the the district attorney in New Orleans, who conducted his investigation in the late 60s, and that culminated in the trial and acquittal of Clay Shaw, who had been charged with conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. And that, of course, became the substance of Oliver Stone's movie JFK, which came out in December 1991. And then finally, in the late 1970s, the U.S. House of Representatives conducted an investigation by what was called the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And that committee looked into the assassinations of both President Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and it concluded that there were probably conspiracies in both cases. In the case of President Kennedy's assassination, the House Select Committee, and particularly I would think its chief counsel, G. Robert Blakey, felt fairly strongly that there might have been some conspiracy on the part of organized crime to kill President Kennedy. The fact then is that the Warren report, or the Warren Commission, said there was one lone assassin. Jim Garrison reached very different conclusions and believed there was a conspiracy, but he was repudiated by the acquittal of Clay Shaw. And I think really somewhat discredited as well by the outcome of that investigation. And then the House Select Committee felt on the basis of some evidence that there was also a conspiracy.
Thank you. Steve Sheen.
Dr. Happenin, what's your personal view on the conspiracy theory?
Well, a conspiracy is plausible, but that doesn't prove it. The fact that something is plausible doesn't mean that it's a proven fact. There's really a whole spectrum of different conspiracy theories that have been generated, blaming sometimes one entity or sometimes a combination, ranging from the Cuban government and Fidel Castro to the Soviets, to the anti-Castro Cuban exiles here in the U.S., to the organized crime, to the military-industrial complex, or even Lyndon Johnson, President Kennedy's successor. If you remember the movie JFK, there really was sort of a combination of some of those forces, particularly the military-industrial complex that was blamed. But that's just a few of the many different conspiracy theories that have been generated. And each one of them has, I would say, some evidence in its behalf, enough to certainly to make it plausible in the minds of many people, but not nearly enough evidence to, at this point in time, establish any one particular conspiracy theory as fact. And certainly historians, I think, are almost unanimous in terms of being skeptical of any particular conspiracy theory.
As a historian, and particularly as a student of the history of the Warren Commission and the assassination, let me ask you to play devil's advocate for a minute. Is there some aspect of the Warren Commission findings that you do find fault with yourself? Or at least is there some portion of evidence that has been presented that you don't think is very compelling? And I think in terms about the assertion that the number of shots fired couldn't have been fired by one person, or is there any other aspect that you go, well, I don't believe in a conspiracy, but I'm not real comfortable with the facts as they're laid out in this part of the investigation?
Yes, I'm not completely comfortable with the idea of a conspiracy, and yet if you look at Lee Harvey Oswald's background, you find that he's very different than just the average person who might, in some sort of fit of insanity, go out and shoot the president. He was an individual who'd spent 2.5 years in the Soviet Union, who'd come back to this country and had some very interesting associates that he rubbed elbows with in both Dallas and New Orleans, who just a few weeks before the assassination went to Mexico City and paid visits to both the Mexican and Soviet consulates there. And he generated the interest of a number of intelligence agencies. As a matter of fact, from the time he left the Marine Corps in 1959 until the time of his own death in 1963, he lived under almost constant scrutiny by some intelligence agency, either the KGB while he was in the Soviet Union, or the FBI, and to some extent the CIA and other agencies while he was here in the U.S. And so he's a person who sort of smacks of intelligence connections. That, of course, is not to say that he was part of a conspiracy, but it certainly raises a question that one would like to put to rest only on the basis of, I think, having seen every last document and heard the full story of what our own government agencies might have known. And that has not yet happened. There has not yet been full, complete disclosure of all the files that the various government agencies in this country compiled on Oswald.
What about the second gun theory? At least according to some sources, I believe that some people contend that 3 shots were fired in about a 5 or 5.5 second period, and gun experts would argue that simply wasn't possible. Is there anything about that specific portion of the evidence that's been presented that bothers you?
Well, I believe the evidence has demonstrated pretty satisfactorily that it's possible. The main question is, was it possible for Lee Harvey Oswald, who had been a mediocre shot in the Marine Corps and apparently had not had much, if any, opportunity to practice his marksmanship when he was apparently planning this act? And those are sort of two different issues. Could it be done, and then could Oswald have done it? Of course, if all the other evidence proves that he was the assassin, then naturally one has to conclude that he was capable of doing it because he did it. But there's some room for doubt on that score. Certainly there's eyewitness evidence, and unfortunately it's almost limited only to that, eyewitness evidence, that there was a gunman on the grassy knoll to the front and right of the presidential limousine, a gunman who could have fired at least one shot. The House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 70s conducted a more or less restaging of the assassination and had shots fired from both the Texas School Book Depository and the grassy knoll. And then they matched those shots, or the actual acoustic patterns made by those shots were the acoustic patterns of certain sounds that were found on a audio tape of the assassination that was more or less conveniently made by the Dallas police in the course of recording police messages, radio messages. And a particular police officer left his microphone button stuck in the on position and apparently picked up some of these sounds by accident. The House Select Committee experts said that there was at least a 95% probability that four sounds on the audio tape were shots being fired, 3 from the depository, 1 from the grassy knoll. Subsequently, though, the National Academy of Sciences and also the FBI both did independent investigations of the audio tape and the sounds and so on, and concluded that for various technical reasons, these were not shots, or they were certainly not sounds that were even made at the precise moment of the assassination. They seem to have been on a part of the tape that was actually recorded at least a couple of minutes later. And so there's still, to this day, I think, something of a controversy over those tapes. But aside from the tapes, then we're dependent totally on eyewitnesses, or ear witnesses, who said they saw something strange or that they heard shots that they believed coming from the grassy knoll. That, of course, really doesn't constitute proof in any final sense.
Professor Happen, in addition to the 3 shot theory that we have, there are some other controversies, and one of them I'd like for you to respond to is that there's been a debate too in the different reports of whether or not that the president's car came to a complete stop or whether it slowed down. What is your reaction to, I believe the Warren Commission's report was that the car did not stop. Is that correct?
That's correct. Several eyewitnesses said that it either slowed down drastically or perhaps even came to a full stop. That was their perception. But of course, they were trying to remember what they saw in a very tumultuous environment where it was probably hard for them to remember exactly. The Zapruder film, that famous 8mm home movie that was made by Abraham Zapruder, does not show the car coming to a complete stop. And so unless, and I think it's unlikely, unless there were frames missing, and there would have to, I think, be a substantial number of frames missing from the Zapruder film, I just really can't conceive of that. Then in fact, that film, I think, shows that the car didn't come to a complete stop. It did slow down, though. I don't think there's any question but that the driver did decelerate the car, whereas it would have been much more effective for him to have rapidly accelerated at the sound of the first shot and tried to get the president out of Dealey Plaza as quickly as humanly possible.
Are you indicating that after the first shot the car slowed down, or was it?
Yes.
Okay. There could be a lot of reasons for that too, could there not?
Yes.
In the moment of crisis and all, how one would react.
Oh, right. Yeah, I'm not in any way trying to say
Right.
that there was anything sinister about that. It's just apparently what happened.
What about the theory that there was a bullet in the curb of the road where the car was at the time of the shooting?
Well, I don't think there's any question about that. A bullet or bullet fragment did seemingly hit the curb, and a piece of that bullet flew up and struck a bystander named James Tague on the face and slightly cut his face. And so between a smudge on the curb and the cut on his face, then it's quite conclusive. However, I don't know of anything that would rule that particular missile out as having been, let's say, a part of the bullet that caused President Kennedy's massive head wound. Some of that bullet was found inside the limousine, but there's no reason why other parts of it could not have flown far and wide.
It can shatter in those
Right.
situations. The other question that arises is the path or angle of the bullets. From your research, and I know, again, the House Committee, I believe, had some different conclusions in the Warren Commission about those path and angles. Could that particular path been taken from the building itself with 3 shots?
Well, the main argument there, I think, is about the so-called magic bullet.
Yes.
Which acquired that name because some people felt it had done more than was possible for any normal bullet to do and remain in such relatively undamaged condition. I find it plausible that the so-called magic bullet did, in fact, follow the trajectory that the Warren Commission and later the House Select Committee on Assassinations agreed upon. In other words, a fairly straight line from the point that it passed through President Kennedy and then into Governor Connally, who was sitting immediately in front of him. The trajectory isn't probably as bothersome, really, as the relatively undamaged shape that the bullet ended up in. It's been described as almost pristine. It was certainly flattened somewhat. But after causing 7 separate wounds in Kennedy and Connally, one would think it would have been much more distorted. Again, though, strange things do happen. Even if one were to say that there's only one chance in a million that the bullet could have done what it did and end up in that shape, one would have to concede that it's possible.
But in that case, the bullet would probably have followed a path where it would not have penetrated bones. Would that be correct?
Well, it did pass through President Kennedy, apparently without striking any major bone. It then entered Governor Connally tumbling, because passing through President Kennedy, it did result in that bullet tumbling end over end. And when a bullet strikes someone tumbling end over end, then it's likely to change the sort of path that it then takes in the wounds, in the way in which it creates those wounds, from a bullet that might have struck him head on without any prior change to its trajectory.
So the critics would, one of the arguments they would have is that they would think that bullet hit the governor without ever hitting the president.
That would be one scenario. There's a couple of different scenarios. One would be that it was a separate bullet, and that because it was a separate bullet, yet so close in time to the one that hit Kennedy first, there had to be 2 gunmen firing. Another scenario would be that the so-called magic bullet never hit anyone, but it was simply planted on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital to implicate Oswald, because it could be shown to have been fired from his rifle. You bring up a good point, though, about how critics will dispute these various points. There's virtually nothing in the Warren report that hasn't been disputed by so-called Warren Commission critics. And these controversies become very complicated, very technical, and there are those who simply refuse to believe virtually any of the official findings of the Warren report.
Professor, 2 other things before I go back to Steve Shink. On the work that you did for Frontline, and then also in a conversation you and I had, the Washington Post did one of the most detailed reports they've done on a subject recently. Would you take both the Washington Post report and the work with Frontline, and would you like to add anything other than what we've been talking about that is new information or is from a different perspective than what we've been reading and seeing over the last 30 years, and particularly those publications that thought it was a conspiracy?
Yes, the article in the Washington Post that came out this past summer was by Ray and Mary LaFontaine of Dallas, Texas. They are a man and wife who are investigative journalists and wrote a series of articles over the past couple of years for the Houston Post before this Washington Post story came out. They have a book that should appear in print next year that's based in good part on files of the Dallas Police Department that have been opened up to public research. And they've also taken advantage of a number of other documents that the federal government has released. You made, I think, reference at the beginning of the program to the Assassination Materials Disclosure Act of 1992. That act was passed by the U.S. Congress, really, I think, more or less as a result of the movie JFK. And what that act will do is, it's already begun to do this, but what it will ultimately do is open up far more of the still unreleased documents that are in government files from the Defense Department, the CIA, the FBI, and so on and so forth. And John Newman, who I've had an opportunity to help with some of his research and collaborate with over the past couple of years, was one of the major contributors to the Frontline episode. And he discovered, for example, and this I think was one of the major revelations of the Frontline program, that Lee Harvey Oswald, despite official statements to the contrary, does quite clearly seem to have been interviewed or interrogated or debriefed, if you want, by the CIA itself after he came back from the Soviet Union in 1962. That was, I think, one of the major revelations of the Frontline program. And John Newman is a retired Army major with many years of experience in intelligence work for the Army and a professor of history. And he also will have a book coming out, I hope, next year, that's going to be based on his very extensive exploration of the documents that have been made available over the past year or two at the National Archives in Washington, D.C.
It sounds like that you saying that some of these documents released will shed more light upon at least the background of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yes, the LaFontaine's article in the Washington Post brought up evidence that Oswald, at least for a little while when he was first arrested and put in jail the day of the assassination, had a couple of, if not cellmates, at least fellow prisoners who were in adjoining cells, and that he seems to have talked to one of those prisoners, who in turn told about what he had heard from Oswald a couple of years later when he approached the sheriff's office and then the FBI in Memphis, Tennessee. And if we're to believe what this prisoner says, and in some respects what he says seems to be pretty accurate as far as, for example, the identity of a third prisoner in that same cell block at the time. If we believe what he says was true, then Oswald seems to have been involved in some kind of gun running operation in Dallas prior to the assassination. And a gun running operation that the FBI and Army Intelligence and the Treasury Department were all investigating. Again, though, you have to remember that doesn't mean he was involved in a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. It certainly could open up, though, knowledge of some new facet of his activities in Dallas that would be extremely interesting.
Well, we'll wait to see what all that brings forth. And on behalf of Steve Schenck and our staff, we want to thank you for being with us today, Professor Halpin. And this is so important and interesting. I'd like to invite you back at a later date when more of this information is out and some of the publications come out. Thank you for your time. You've been most informative.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I've enjoyed it.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. Larry Halpin, who is a political communications professor at Lewis Clark State College, speaking of the Warren Commission report and the assassination of JFK. I want to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time when we will discuss yet another significant issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.